The north is cold and full of whispers.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. He had already won. The dragon pit was loud with something that wasn't quite celebration. It was the sound of people watching a thing they had expected to be over, still happening, a sustained, collective held breath from 200 Westerosi lords and their retinues, all of them watching a Dornish prince they had never thought much of circle a man the size of a building who was bleeding into the sand. Sir Gregor Clegane lay on his back. His armor was locked around him like a shell around something dying inside it. One pauldron had been wrenched half off during the fight, and the exposed shoulder beneath was weeping through the chainmail where the spear tip had opened him twice. He was not dead. His chest was moving, armor rising and falling with the effort of it, the way bellows move when someone is forcing air through cracked pipes. His greatsword lay 6 feet away in the churned sand. He could not reach it. Oberyn was not thinking about the sword. He had come to the dragon pit that morning with 2 spears rather than 1. The officiating marshal had noted it and chosen not to contest it, because Oberyn Martell was a prince and the champion of a condemned man, and no marshal of King's Landing was looking for reasons to create difficulties before the trial had even begun. The second spear leaned against the gallery railing above the pit entrance, placed there at dawn, because a man who had seen his own skull crushed between 2 enormous hands was not going to walk into the same yard a second time without a contingency. He rolled his shoulders once, feeling the ache in his left side where Gregor's fist had caught him early in the fight. A blow that had lifted him off his feet and would have ended a man with less understanding of how the body absorbs punishment. He moved in a slow circle around the mountain's body. The sand was churned dark in places. The smell of it was copper and sweat and something else, something that always surprised people who had never stood in a pit, almost sweet. He stopped circling. He faced the gallery. Elia Martell. His voice carried without strain because he had spent 20 years rehearsing the carrying of those 2 words. Princess of Dorne, wife of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. He waited. 1 beat. 2. Your men killed her. Your men killed her children. Say their names. Say what you did. He looked at Gregor. Say it. And then we finish. The gallery was very quiet. Gregor's head turned toward him with the slow, hydraulic patience of something enormous that has not yet accepted it is losing. His face was blank in the specific way of a man who has always lived in a world where only the next 5 seconds mattered. He said nothing. Oberyn stepped forward. And the future arrived. It did not come as a dream comes. Soft, contextless, deniable. It came the way a memory arrives when you have been working very hard not to remember it, all at once, specific and saturated with sensation so complete that the body stops knowing the difference between then and now. He felt his skull change shape, not pain, not exactly. The sensation of structural failure, of something that had always been solid, becoming not solid. His own temple bending inward under a pressure that should not have existed, the specific and intimate wrongness of 2 enormous thumbs pressing where they had no right to press. His ears filled with a sound like a door closing in a house with very thick walls. The light went wrong. Then, his daughter, Obara, standing on a ship's deck. He knew the slant of it, the color of the sails, the specific quality of evening light over the summer sea. Obara's face was doing something he had never seen Obara's face do in 25 years of watching it. It was surprised. She was looking down at the haft of her own spear protruding from her chest, and she was surprised, and before she had finished being surprised, she was gone. And someone was laughing with the particular wrongness of a man for whom another person's death is a personal entertainment. Then fire. Not forge fire. Not hearth fire. Fire that moved laterally, the way water moves when you tip a cup, seeking, spreading, finding. It came from above, from something enormous and alive with a jaw that could swallow a destroyer whole. The buildings of King's Landing, this city, these specific buildings visible through the arched stone of the dragon pit above him, burning from the top down while 500,000 people ran in every direction that led nowhere fast enough. The smell of wildfire was specific, and he had smelled it once before at a different scale in a different city, and he had told himself he would never forget it. He had not been wrong. Then the wall. He had seen the wall once, years ago, briefly, from distance, a young man's appetite for the extreme, nothing more. He remembered it as impressive. Immovable, what arrived in the vision was different. What arrived was the wall's final understanding that something larger than itself existed. A sound that was not wind preceded something that was not quite walking, something that occupied a different set of physical rules than the world Oberyn lived in, something that had decided winter was insufficiently cold and had come to correct the error. And behind it, barely visible because the dark ahead of it was a different quality of dark than ordinary dark. Shapes, moving, not dozens, not hundreds. 5 seconds. Oberyn Martell was standing in the dragon pit. The sand was still churned and dark. Gregor was still breathing. The 200 lords had not moved, and none of them knew that the man holding the spear had just lived a complete second life between one heartbeat and the next. His hands were shaking. He looked at them. He made them stop. He looked at Gregor. The mountain was bleeding and breathing and waiting for the final act of a performance that Oberyn had been composing for 2 decades. The confession. The public naming. Tywin forced to hear his own order recited aloud from the throat of the man who had carried it out. He had wanted that. He had crossed 3,000 miles and stood in this pit and taken a fist to the ribs for that. He looked at Tywin Lannister. The old lion was sitting very still in the gallery the way men of absolute power always sit when something has nearly returned to going the way they planned. Hands folded, face composed, watching with the patient attention of a man who had spent 60 years watching other men expend their fury and then setting his house back in order afterward. Gregor Clegane was an already discharged weapon. He had done the work Tywin had paid him to do 17 years ago in a room in King's Landing that no one in this gallery would name aloud. Killing him slowly, making him confess, prolonging the theater, gave this moment to Gregor, made Gregor the center of the story. And Gregor was not the center of anything. Gregor was the blade. Tywin was the hand that had raised it. The blade was lying in the sand, bleeding out. The hand was sitting 30 feet away, wearing a gold badge that said it ran the realm. Oberyn reversed his grip. He stepped back. 1 step. 2. He wanted distance. He wanted full range. He did not want to be within arm's reach of Gregor Clegane when this ended, because he had just seen, in full physical detail. What happened when you were within arm's reach of Gregor Clegane? He settled his weight. He felt the spear's balance shift through his palm, the way it always felt when his body had stopped thinking and was simply doing what 42 years had made it capable of doing. He set his back foot. He threw, not a jab, a full throw, shoulder and hip rotating hard into it, the spear leaving his hand with a release he felt in his jaw. The spearhead crossed 9 feet of arena sand and entered Gregor Clegane's throat with a sound that was very small for what it was. The mountain's chest moved twice. Then it did not move again. The gallery erupted. The sound was enormous and confused, the sound of 200 people who did not know whether they were watching an ending or a beginning and were making noise to fill the space of not knowing. Oberyn did not lower his spear. He had another. He turned. He found Tywin Lannister's face in the gallery, a face that had not moved, not the brows, not the jaw, not the folded hands. Only the eyes. The eyes had registered something. A data point, a recalibration. The gods have spoken. The same voice he had used to say Elia's name. Flat, carrying, 20 years of controlled fury beneath it like water beneath ice. The dwarf is free. He let that land. He gave it the second it needed. But I have more to say. 200 people heard those 7 words and did nothing with them for a long moment, because nothing in the rules of this particular proceeding covered a man who had just killed the defendant's champion and then refused to leave. Oberyn planted his feet. The spear was still in his hand, not the one he had used on Gregor, which was now 9 feet away in the sand with a dead man around it, but the second one. The one he had carried down from the gallery rail when the first left his hand. His Dornish guard, 4 men he had brought north specifically because they understood that protecting him meant reading a room and moving before they were told, had already left their positions along the pit wall and were crossing the sand. Not toward Oberyn, toward Tyrion Lannister. Tyrion was standing at the pit's edge where he had been watching the combat, looking at Oberyn with an expression that lived somewhere between profound confusion and the specific anxiety of a man who has just been acquitted by the gods and is watching someone ensure the gods' verdict is honored before the gods' jurisdiction expires. The Dornish men closed around him, quietly, without touching him, like walls that happened to have arms. The trial was, technically, still in session. It was in session until a presiding lord declared it concluded. No such declaration had been made. Oberyn had no authority to make it. Tywin, technically, could. He had not. Oberyn was not going to let him. He turned to the gallery. He looked at the assembled faces, the lords and their retinues, the gold cloaks stationed at the exits, the household knights standing behind their masters. He looked at Tommen in the royal gallery, a boy of 10, wearing the weight of a crown he had not expected and did not understand. His eyes too wide, his hands gripping the gallery rail with both fists. He looked at Cersei beside him, whose expression had the quality of something very controlled by an effort that was starting to cost. He looked at Tywin. He did not raise his voice. There was a girl named Tysha. He said it the way a maester reads from a ledger. Flat, unadorned, each word placed with the patience of a man who has rehearsed nothing, because he does not need to. She was 16 years old. A crofter's daughter from the Westerlands, she married the Hand's youngest son, genuinely before a septon, with witnesses and words that cannot be unmade. The Hand decided this was unsuitable. He paused. So he told his son the girl was a whore, a paid performance designed to flatter a lonely boy. Then he had her given to his household guard, each man in turn. When they were done, he had his son go last. Because she was a whore, he said, and whores deserve a whore's fee. He gave his own son a silver coin. The gallery did not move. Oberyn watched three faces. Tywin's hands, folded on the rail in front of him, did not unfold, but the tendons in them changed. Something tightened in the wrists, a measurement smaller than most people would notice. He had sat in rooms for 60 years, learning not to react. He was not reacting. But something was working very hard to achieve that outcome. Jaime Lannister, standing 10 feet to his father's right in white armor, was looking at the ground. His jaw had moved once when Tysha's name was spoken. His jaw had not moved since. It was the face of a man who has known something for years that he has chosen not to examine, because examining it would require doing something about it, and there was no something available to do. He was looking at the sand of the dragon pit floor, the way people look at things that are not the thing they are actually seeing. Tyrion, from inside his ring of Dornish guards, was watching Oberyn with an expression Oberyn did not need to analyze. It was the expression a man makes when he hears out loud, in a public place, in the flat voice of documented fact, the thing that broke him. I am not finished. Oberyn let the gallery have one breath more of silence. Robb Stark and 3,500 of his men sat down to a feast at the Twins this past year. They were guests of Lord Walder Frey. They died beneath his roof. Under guest right. Under the law that has governed every host and every guest in this realm since the first men put words to it. His voice did not rise. Lords Frey and Bolton did not act alone. The hand of the king wrote the letters that opened those gates. The sound that moved through the gallery was not loud. It was the sound of breath changing texture, of lords who had been still becoming slightly less still. In the back of the gallery, where the household knights of minor northern lords stood, one man's hand had found the hilt of a sword and not moved from it. Tywin stood. He did not raise his voice either. Two men in the same room, neither raising their voice, was the most dangerous kind of conversation. Captain, he addressed the gold cloak standing nearest the pit entrance, a broad man with a scarred chin and the look of someone who had spent his career doing things lords told him to do without asking the underlying reasoning. Prince Oberyn has discharged his obligation as champion. The trial is concluded. He will be escorted to his quarters pending review of these slanderous statements. The captain took one step. Oberyn's spear turned. It did not move fast or dramatically. It turned the way a weather vane turns, smoothly, inevitably, pointing toward the thing that had changed. The spearhead was at the captain's eye level. The captain was 12 feet away. The captain had seen what the man holding that spear had done to a man the size of a destroyer 4 minutes ago. The captain did not take a second step. The trial is still in session. Oberyn's eyes had not left Tywin. The yard belongs to the jurisdiction of the gods until the champion leaves it. I have not left it. The captain knows this. A brief acknowledgement to the captain without looking at him, the kind of acknowledgement that makes someone feel they have been understood rather than threatened, which was significantly more effective than the alternative. My lord hand, call them off. Or, explain to every lord assembled here why the man whose champion just lost requires soldiers to remove a Dornish prince before the Dornish prince has finished speaking. Tywin sat down. It was the correct decision, and everyone in the gallery recognized it as such, and the recognition cost him something. A man of Tywin Lannister's particular power did not often make decisions that were merely correct in the absence of also being advantageous. The room felt the rarity of it. Your Grace. Oberyn turned to Tommen. The boy's knuckles were white on the gallery rail. He was old enough to understand that something was happening that the adults in the room had not prepared him for, and young enough to find that terrifying rather than useful. The gods have spoken in this yard today. An innocent man was nearly executed for a crime the gods have declared he did not commit. He gave Tommen the version of his voice that he reserved for people he needed to trust him. Not warmth exactly, something more like steadiness. Dorne invokes its right of formal petition. We ask that the Crown open an inquiry into the conduct of Tywin Lannister, Hand of the King, in relation to the deaths of Princess Oberyn Martell, the Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, and the infant Aegon Targaryen during the sack of King's Landing 17 years past. Before these lords, under oath. He waited. Tommen looked at his grandfather. Tywin's face told Tommen nothing, because Tywin's face had never told anyone anything it had not chosen to. But the boy had a mother, and his mother was gripping the gallery rail beside him, and whatever Cersei's expression was doing was telling Tommen something, even if Tommen couldn't have articulated what. The Crown will. Tommen's voice was small and very careful and working hard. The Crown will take the petition under consideration. It was not an agreement. It was not a refusal. It was the answer a child gives when the adults in his life have stopped agreeing and he has not yet learned how to exist in the space between them. It was enough. Ellaria Sand caught Oberyn's eye from the gallery, a look that lasted less than a second. That required no words, because they had spent 12 years learning to communicate in the compression of looks. She stood. She moved along the gallery toward the exit. Below her, the 4 Dornish men around Tyrion began moving toward the same door, with Tyrion between them, not quite escorted, not quite propelled, existing in the careful legal fiction of a free man choosing to walk in a particular direction that happened to coincide with where 4 armed men were walking. Tyrion looked back at Oberyn as they moved him. His voice was quiet, aimed at the gap beneath the gallery noise. Whatever you're doing later, Oberyn said it without turning his head. I want you to know that I don't fully understand what's happening. That makes you the only honest man in this yard. They were gone through the side door before Tywin could recalculate the geometry of the room in time to matter. Oberyn stayed in the pit alone for one more moment. He looked at Gregor. He looked at the dark sand around him. He looked at the spear still standing in the dead man's throat, at the poison that was already doing its secondary work in the wound, confirming what he had already confirmed with steel. He thought about his daughters. He thought about the wall. He turned and walked toward the main exit. In the gallery, Tywin Lannister rose. He turned toward the corridor that led back to the Tower of the Hand. Cersei moved beside him, speaking quietly into the space between them, asking something, what, exactly, could not be heard from below. Tywin did not answer her. He walked. It was the first time in this story, and he did not know it was the first time. And that was the only advantage Oberyn still had over him. The chamber was a storage room that Ellaria had converted into something defensible in the space of an hour. Stone shelves cleared of their contents, a door that locked from the inside with a bar built for a larger frame and therefore slightly inadequate, but workable. 3 Dornish men in the corridor outside who understood that their instructions required them to prevent entry, regardless of title or rank, without asking Oberyn to define what regardless meant. Tyrion Lannister was sitting on one of the cots when Oberyn entered. He had been sitting there since the escort brought him, based on the undisturbed dust on the stone floor that showed no footprints beyond the ones leading from the door to the cot. He had sat down and not moved. He had been thinking. The specific quality of thinking a man does when he has just had his deepest private wound announced to 200 strangers in a public arena was not something Oberyn needed to ask about. He recognized the posture, the stillness that is not calm. How? Tyrion said it as a fact, not a question. Not how did you do it, not how dare you, just the word itself, bare, requiring a foundation. Oberyn pulled the second cot close enough for conversation and sat. He did not apologize for the public announcement. Apologizing for a deliberate tactical decision to a man intelligent enough to recognize it as deliberate would have been an insult to both of them. "I know a great deal about you," Oberyn said. "More than you have told me. More, perhaps, than you have told anyone." That is not an answer to the word how. "No," Oberyn agreed. "It isn't." Tyrion's mismatched eyes had been doing something throughout the Dragon Pit proceedings that they were still doing now, working. Cataloging, a man who had survived his entire life by being faster in the mind than everyone who wanted him dead, had spent the last hour building a model of Oberyn Martell and was not satisfied with what the model explained. "You announced something in that pit that only 4 people in the world know," Tyrion said. "My father. My brother. The girl herself, if she lived. And me." A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "My father would not have told you. My brother would not have told you. I have not told you." Which leaves a category of explanation that I am finding difficult to construct. "Then, don't construct it yet," Oberyn said. "I'll give you something more useful to do with the effort." He looked at Tyrion with a directness Tyrion was clearly not accustomed to receiving, not armored in performance, not deployed as strategy. Just the plain gaze of a man about to deliver information that would not be comfortable to receive. "She is alive." Tyrion did not move. "Tisha, your wife. She did not disappear into the world the way dead things disappear. She was sent away. Given coin. Not the coin you were told about. Something more substantial. Enough to travel east. Far enough to fall outside the reach of a lord who had already stopped thinking about her. She is not in the Westerlands. She has not been for 20 years. Your father sent her away because a crofter's daughter who accepted her removal was not a problem worth maintaining." The silence that followed was not the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of a man rearranging 20 years of interior architecture in which the foundation stones had been load-bearing. "She loved you," Oberyn said. "I am telling you this not to give you something to grieve over. I am telling you this because you need to understand which direction your anger should be pointed. You have spent 2 decades believing your father revealed something true about the world, that love is transaction, that warmth is performance, that every kindness offered to a dwarf is manufactured to serve someone else's purpose. He did not reveal the truth. He constructed a lie and forced you to witness it and participate in it. Those are not the same thing." Tyrion's jaw moved once. Something crossed his face that was not grief and was not rage, and was the specific combination of both that a man produces when he has spent years metabolizing a wound in the wrong direction and suddenly understands which direction was correct. Then he said, very quietly, "You have approximately 3 more minutes of my patience on this subject before I become interested only in what you want from me." "I want the layout of your father's solar," Oberyn said. "Specifically where he keeps his personal correspondence." Tyrion looked at him with the expression of a man who has identified the destination and is rapidly working out that he has already agreed to the journey. The red wedding letters. No heat in it. No surprise. The flat recognition of a man who has spent enough time with power to know what evidence looks like when someone is going after it. Among others. Tyrion considered this for exactly as long as required to acknowledge a decision he had already made. The solar's eastern wall has a cabinet built into the stone. It presents as structural, a buttress, but the lower section has a panel. Myrish lock, 6-pin tumbler. Tywin rotates documents every fortnight, What's there now is current. The clerks who handle outgoing ravens work the third bell each morning without exception. A brief pause. The courier who physically carried the Frey communication was Sir Harris Bywater, loyal to my father personally, not to the office. Men in that position frequently keep copies of their own commissions. Insurance, Oberyn absorbed every word without writing any of it down. Writing things down in rooms with inadequate locks was a discipline he had never allowed himself to relax. Good, now, Tyrion said. You will explain to me what is actually happening. Oberyn looked at him. The decision to tell Tyrion had been made in the Dragon Pit when he chose him as the first ally in this city who needed to understand the full scope of what was coming. The calculation now was only how. I saw something during the combat, Oberyn said. Before I killed Gregor. Not a dream. Not a fever. Memory of events that have not occurred yet. Specific, physical, causally sequential. Things that will happen if the next several years proceed the way they are inclined to proceed. Tyrion was quiet for 3 full seconds. You are describing green sight, the ability attributed to the children of the forest and approximately 4 documented human beings in recorded history. I am describing what I experienced. Categorize it however is satisfying. What did you see? Your father's legacy, completed. Oberyn said it without cruelty and without theater. Cersei holding a throne she is unable to hold, and the city burning, not as a figure of speech, a dragon large enough to interrupt the horizon, setting the districts of King's Landing alight from above, while 500,000 people discover that fire moves faster than they do. Tyrion was very still. Daenerys Targaryen. Eventually, yes, and before eventually? The wall falls. The room absorbed that for a moment. The wall, Tyrion repeated. Not mocking, not dismissing. The tone of a man picking up something to examine its weight before forming a verdict. I know what you are about to say, Oberyn said, because it is the correct thing to say. And you are not a man who avoids correct things on grounds of preference. The wall has stood for 8,000 years. The Night's Watch maintains it. The wildlings are a manageable threat. The stories of the others are instruments of childhood discipline, not historical documentation. Broadly, yes, tell me what the wall smelled like. Tyrion blinked. You have been there, Oberyn said. You stood on top of it. You looked north. I want to know what the air smelled like when you looked north. Tyrion was quiet for a long moment. His eyes were doing the cataloging. Then, carefully, cold. Ice. Something underneath the cold that I did not examine closely because I had no particular reason to. There was a reason. You did not have it at the time. Oberyn leaned forward slightly. The army beyond the wall that I saw was not composed of wildlings. It was not composed of men. It moved without communication, because communication requires individual decision-making, and the things moving did not have individual decision-making available to them anymore. He held Tyrion's gaze. It was not large the way a Lannister host is large. It was large the way a tide is large. And at the front of it was something that had looked at winter and decided winter was insufficient. Tyrion steepled his fingers over his mouth. He held that position while a man of his particular intelligence worked the variables at speed. Then, you understand, I cannot simply accept this. I know. But I can accept that a man of your education and temperament would not be constructing this argument without grounds he considers sufficient. He lowered his hands. And I can accept that if you are correct, even directionally correct, then everything being done in King's Landing right now is rearranging furniture in a building scheduled for demolition. Yes, so the work of dismantling my father, building alliances, reforming the court, buys the realm the structure and the unity required to survive what comes after. Fractured kingdoms fighting each other cannot fight north. A court consumed by Lannister succession cannot prepare a wall that actually needs men behind it. Oberyn met his eyes steadily. I need a functioning realm. You need your father destroyed. These are not competing interests. Tyrion's jaw had settled into a new configuration. The defensive irony that lived at the surface of his expression had gone somewhere else, and what was underneath it was precisely what Oberyn had hoped would be there. Intelligent fury, with a specific target and a productive direction. "You asked the wrong question," Oberyn said, "when you demanded a trial by combat." Tyrion waited. "You should have asked who put the poison in the pie." "A beat." "I had assumed," Tyrion said carefully, "that everyone in King's Landing already understood Olenna Tyrell was responsible for Joffrey's death. Everyone understands it." Oberyn's tone did not change. "No one will say it." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the acknowledgement that one existed and was being deliberately held in reserve. "I intend to say it." To her face. As an offer, rather than a threat. Tyrion studied him. The silence lasted for the space of a genuine assessment. Not performance, not deflection, but the actual time required to measure a thing accurately. "You are either the most dangerous man in Westeros," Tyrion said, "or you are completely mad." "The gods," Oberyn replied, "seem unable to decide." The correspondence room was small and smelled of tallow and the particular dryness of stored vellum. One candle. A desk pushed against the wall so that anyone sitting at it had their back to the door. A position Oberyn only accepted because the door had 3 Dornish men outside it, and because the work in front of him required that he not spend attention on the entrance. The cipher was not the family cipher. The family cipher, which he and Doran had used for 30 years, had passed through the hands of at least 4 maesters and 2 members of the small council over those decades. Because codes maintained across 30 years find other people's hands regardless of how carefully they are kept. What Oberyn was writing used a different language, the language of shared childhood, of specific incidents and private shorthand that existed between 2 brothers and existed nowhere else in the world. He began, "The orange grove behind the old stables. The one father forbade us to enter after what happened with the hunting dogs. The afternoon you found me there when I was 7 and chose not to tell him. You said, 'Some secrets are better than loyalty.' I am writing to tell you that you were right." Doran would understand. The orange grove was real. The hunting dogs were real. The afternoon was a specific, dated, unverifiable memory that lived in exactly 2 minds. A maester intercepting this letter would see family sentiment, the correspondence of brothers who had grown old. Doran would read it as something else entirely. "I have information that cannot be explained by any conventional channel. Trust it regardless. It is as real and specific as that afternoon, and I am staking everything on your trusting it." He continued, "The grass is no longer sufficient cover. The viper must be seen now, or there will be nothing left to conceal beneath it. March, not for the thing we have been preparing. March because what comes after the thing we have been preparing is older and colder than anything inside the plan. And Dorne's children will need their fathers to have moved in time." The viper in the grass, their private name for Doran's long work, the patient alignment, the hidden preparation, the 2 decades of careful movement toward something that most of Westeros did not know was being moved toward. Doran had never written it in any correspondence. He had never spoken it in any room containing more than 3 trusted people. Oberyn invoking it here, inside a childhood cipher, in language that sounded like family metaphor to an outside reader, told his brother one thing with the clarity of a blade laid flat on a table: "I know the innermost thing. I have known it since before the moment that changed me. The moment was real, and so is what I know, and there is no time left for the patience game." He did not explain the vision. Not in a letter. Some things could not survive the reduction. He closed. Advance party first. 300 by sea from the Planky Town, arriving before this raven is a fortnight old. The host behind them, framed as what it legally is. A great house responding to the demonstrated instability of a crown that nearly executed an innocent man beneath its own roof, while the hand who arranged a massacre at a wedding table remains in his tower. We are not marching to take anything. We are marching because Dorne's children deserve to inherit a realm that is still standing. He rolled the vellum. He pressed his personal seal into the wax. Then, a second seal in a color that Doran alone would know required full attention. He carried it to the Raven Master himself, watched the bird clear the manse's roofline and bank south, disappearing into the gray King's Landing sky. Illyria was in the corridor when he turned back. She had been standing there for some time in the way she had always had, present without announcing herself, reading the room without needing to enter it. "He'll move?" she asked. "He has been waiting for permission for 20 years, Oberyn said. "I have given it to him in a language no intercepted letter can decode." She looked at him for a moment longer. "Then, I sent my own bird yesterday. Confirmation of the trial, Tyrion's status, Tywin's position. He'll have 2 sources." "Good," Oberyn said. "Dorne does not act on one source. The Water Gardens, Sunspear, 4 days later. The pools in the afternoon were the sound of children. Dorne had made them so, deliberately, years ago, high-born and common children playing together in the same water. Because a prince who grew among other people's children understood, in his bones rather than his policy, that other people's children mattered. He had raised his own here. He had aged here. He had spent 20 years conducting a war that no one could see from this garden, between the sound of one child's laughter and the next. He sat in his chair at the garden's edge. His feet were wrapped in clean linen and elevated on their cushioned rest, because his feet had been making decisions about his mobility for the past 3 years without consulting him. The gout was not debilitating. It was a negotiation, a continuous, low-level renegotiation between what his body offered and what the day required. He had become, out of necessity, skilled at it. Areo Hota brought him the raven. Then, separate, carried in Hota's other hand, a second roll of vellum, smaller, sealed differently, written in a woman's hand he recognized. Doran took Oberyn's letter first. He read the outer seal, the inner seal. He held the inner wax color in the light for 5 seconds, recognizing it. He broke the seal and read. He read it once. He read it a second time, more slowly, the way a careful man reads a document he intends to act on and cannot afford to misunderstand. He set it on his knee and watched the children. A boy of perhaps 6 had climbed to the lip of the highest pool and was conducting an internal debate about whether to jump. He stood at the edge, looking down at the drop, calculating with the specific seriousness of a child for whom this decision was the most important decision of his afternoon. Then, he jumped. He went under, came back up with water streaming off his face, shook it from his hair, and immediately turned to climb back up and do it again. Doran exhaled. Not a smile. Something older than a smile. The release of breath a man produces when a thing he has maintained hope for across 20 years, without certainty, without any reliable indication that hope was rational, has finally confirmed itself as real. He took Ilaria's letter. He read it quickly. 2 sources. Consistent in every particular. "Areo," he said. Hota stepped from his position at Doran's right shoulder and stood before him. The axe at Hota's back was the same weapon he had carried from Norvos at 18, the same axe every day since. His face, as always, presented nothing to read. "How many days to the Boneway?" Doran asked. Hota had the number already. He always had the number. Forced march puts the advance party at the Planky Town in 3 days. A fast galley with a strong crew makes King's Landing in 11 days if the winds are with us. A pause. 14 days total. Then they will have 14 days, Doran said. He had watched the weather along that coastline for 40 years, and he had no patience for captains who used bad winds as excuses. Captain Damon Uller's company. 300. They finished their extended deployment training this past winter, and I have been waiting for a reason to use that training. Tell Daemon he answers to no one in King's Landing except my brother, and if my brother is not reachable, to the woman who carries his seal. He paused. Tell him to bring the good shields, not the ceremonial ones. Hota turned. I will write the letter to Tommen myself, Doran said. Hota stopped. In 22 years of service, Hota had seen Doran dictate perhaps 4 letters and write the rest with his own hand, because a man who believed that words coming out of a room carried consequences had a responsibility to account personally for each word. Hota acknowledged this with a nod and left him to it. The letter Oberyn Martell sent to King Tommen, first of his name, was formal, warm, and legally constructed with the precision of a document 20 years in preparation. It expressed the Principality of Dorne's deep concern for the recent instability of the crown, the assassination of one king, the near execution of an innocent man beneath the court's own roof. and the formal and public accusation of treasonous conspiracy leveled against the serving hand of the king. It expressed Dorne's absolute loyalty to the crown and its specific, long-standing, treaty-protected interest in the matter of Princess Elia Martell. It did not mention that 300 armed men had already broken camp. It did not mention that the full Dornish host would begin its march before the raven carrying this letter had reached the Red Keep's maester. What it did say, in careful and legally precise language, was that Dorne had entered the realm of its own will through the marriage compact between the Princess Daenerys Targaryen and Oberyn Martell, and that the terms of that entry had never transferred Dornish autonomy to the Iron Throne. A great house conducting itself in the interest of the realm's stability, the letter stated, was not aggression. It was the exercise of a duty to a crown that had come under strain. It was the most dangerous letter in Westeros. It had been written by a man who had spent 20 years composing it in his own head, refining it in the privacy of his thoughts, waiting for the morning when it would need to exist as ink on vellum rather than intention. He sealed it. He gave it to the raven. He sat with his feet on their rest and listened to the children in the pools until the evening light changed and the garden quieted. In the Dornish manse in King's Landing, Oberyn received Doran's confirmation 9 days after the cipher had left. A single line in the same childhood language: "The grove is no longer behind us. We are walking through it." He read it at the window. Gray morning light. The sounds of the city assembling itself in the streets below, cartwheels on stone, a fishmonger's first call of the day. The distant change of the gold cloak watch at the nearest gate. He thought about Daemon Uller's company, 3 days from the harbor. He thought about the full host moving through the boneway, the way water moves through a long channel, steady, continuous, building pressure against whatever it was moving toward. He had 14 days until he had a physical shield at his back. He had perhaps 35 days, approximately, until he had leverage that Tywin Lannister could not answer with a gold cloak and a direct order. 35 days to turn the court of King's Landing from the inside, to dismantle 60 years of Lannister architecture using the tools of the man who built it. He had started campaigns with less. He set Doran's confirmation in the candle flame and held it until he had to let go. He watched the last of it curl and blacken on the desk, the childhood language reducing to ash, leaving nothing a maester could read. Outside, King's Landing carried on in its ordinary hunger, entirely unaware that the most patient man in Westeros had just, after 20 years, stopped waiting. The child was perhaps 9 years old. She appeared at the Dornish manse's side entrance in the hour before midnight in the way only King's Landing managed it. The streets not quite empty, the last of the evening's commerce still moving, enough residual noise to cover a small figure crossing between buildings without being noted. She handed the door guard a folded piece of paper the size of a coin. One word on it, in a hand that was deliberate and clean and had been carefully stripped of any identifying feature: "Tonight." Oberyn read it at the correspondence room window. He turned it over, nothing on the reverse. He held it near the candle long enough to confirm the ink was ordinary, and the paper was ordinary, and the only extraordinary thing about it was the certainty it carried, the certainty of a man who expected to be recognized by a single word and had judged his expectation correctly. He had been waiting for this meeting since the Dragon Pit. He was surprised only that it had taken 6 days. He strapped on the spear. The passage was not on any architectural record of the Red Keep produced in the last 40 years. It was older than the current building, part of Maegor's original construction, a corridor so narrow a man of regular width had to turn his shoulders sideways to move through it. It connected a storage annex behind the small council chamber to a room that appeared on no inventory as anything other than a secondary archive for obsolete tax records. One candle was burning when Oberyn entered, already halfway down, which meant it had been lit some time before his arrival, which meant Varys had come first and wanted that fact established before anything else. Varys stood near the room's single window, a slit of stone barely wide enough to admit a forearm, overlooking a dark and empty courtyard. He wore robes the color of a deep bruise, hands folded inside opposite sleeves, his face carrying the expression of a man who has arranged a conversation he finds moderately interesting and is waiting to discover whether his preliminary read holds. He was unarmed. He was always unarmed. in the way a man is unarmed when his weapons are not the kind that can be taken at a door. Oberyn set the spear against the wall to his right, close enough to reach in a single step. He did it without looking at Varys, because the gesture needed to be visible, unhurried, and entirely without apology. Varys looked at the spear. Then, at Oberyn. How much time do we have? Not, how do you know what you know? Not, explain yourself. Not, what happened in the dragon pit. He had looked at the events of the past 6 days, drawn the correct conclusion about their origin, and moved directly to the operational question, because the operational question was what the meeting was for, and everything else was already answered. Oberyn studied him. More than we deserve, less than we need. 3 years, perhaps 4, before the dead breach the wall. Whether the realm can face them when that happens depends entirely on whether those years are spent preparing or spent burning each other into the ground. Varys was quiet for the length of a careful breath. You saw this. I saw what happens if nothing changes, and you intend to change it. I am already changing it. The question is whether you change with it or spend your effort working against it. Varys turned slightly from the window. The candlelight did something specific to his face, the soft features that people persistently mistook for softness, the eyes doing something entirely different from what the rest of the expression suggested. You are going to tell me that you know something about me. Something that should not be possible to know. You will use it as your opening position, and I will spend the first portion of this conversation calculating whether you actually know it or have constructed a convincing approximation. The pleasant expression did not shift. I would prefer to move past that portion. Then I'll remove the uncertainty, Oberyn said. Illyrio Mapatis, Pentos, the arrangement he has maintained for you for the past decade, the specific financial instruments, the contracted military component. He held Varys's gaze without concession. The Golden Company. The room was very still. What happened to Varys's face was not dramatic. It was small and precise, a recalibration in the muscles around the eyes, the specific adjustment a man makes when the model he has been running encounters data outside its parameters. Varys had spent decades being the best-informed person in every room he entered. He had arranged his life, at considerable personal cost, to ensure this remained permanently true. He had never been in a room with someone who knew this particular thing. He had been extraordinarily careful to prevent it. No one outside Illyrio's household knows that, he said. Not a protest, a fact being revised. I know it, Oberyn said simply. Several seconds passed. I see, Varys said. No, not yet, but I am going to explain what is coming, and then you will. Oberyn moved to the far wall and set his back against cold stone, the habit of a man who did not sit down in rooms he hadn't inspected. You have a plan for the realm, a Targaryen restoration. A claimant, a contracted army, a carefully managed sequence of political conditions. It is a good plan. 15 years of good work have gone into it. He paused. It will fail. It will fail, Varys repeated, in the tone of a man who is not conceding the point but has too much discipline to argue before understanding the grounds. Not because of Tywin, not because of any southern opposition. It will fail because your candidate, whichever claimant you have built toward, will rule a kingdom of the dead if the north falls before the throne is stable. Oberyn's voice remained the same throughout, a scholar presenting findings, not a man fighting a corner. The army beyond the wall does not negotiate. It does not observe succession crises. It does not care about the Iron Throne or the name of the person sitting it. What I saw was not a military force in any sense you and I would recognize. It was a weather event that moved in formation. Varys looked at him. He was not a man who dismissed the supernatural on principle. He had been touched by it too early and too personally for the luxury of dismissal. A sorcerer in Myr had burned something of him as a child and heard a voice answer from the fire, and Varys had spent his entire life building systems of ordinary human intelligence as a wall against the knowledge that the magical world was real, and had demonstrated no particular interest in the well-being of the people living inside it. He hated magic with a specific, informed hatred. He respected it with the cold respect of someone who has seen what it can do, and made the decision once to construct his life around making sure it never touched him again. It had touched him again. Standing in this room, through a man with a Dornish spear propped against the wall. "What do you want from me?" Varys asked. 3 things. Oberyn's voice did not change. First, confirmation. Your birds in the Tower of the Hand, I have a location for the Red Wedding correspondence. I need independent verification before I present it in a formal proceeding. A source that cannot be challenged is Dornish interest. Varys considered this for exactly as long as it required. That can be arranged. Second, Pycelle. He is Tywin's instrument on the small council, and has been for 30 years. He will move against every proceeding I bring before that council. I need him removed from the field. Varys's expression shifted towards something that was almost amusement, and was more accurately described as professional appreciation for a well-identified problem. Pycelle has curated a number of private secrets over the years that reflect poorly on him. Several are currently in my possession. A well-placed revelation before an appropriate audience could render his continued participation in small council matters uncomfortable. He let a beat pass. The mechanism is not your concern, only the outcome, Oberyn agreed. The third thing is silence. You will not carry anything from this room to Tywin Lannister. The Red Wedding evidence, the Dornish host. Anything that moves between now and the end of the inquiry. Nothing reaches his tower from you. The pause that followed was the most specific pause of the conversation. Everything before it had been negotiation approaching a point. This was the point. You are asking me to choose a side, Varys said. I am asking you to decline to choose his, Oberyn replied. Those are not the same thing. Your plans continue. Your arrangements continue. I am not asking you to burn anything you have built. I am asking you to open certain doors and leave certain others closed. Varys moved from the window. He walked to the center of the room with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is giving himself the small courtesy of walking toward it rather than simply arriving at it. The candle threw his shadow long and soft against the back wall. The birds in the Tower of the Hand will have your confirmation by morning, he said. Pycelle will encounter a private difficulty before this week ends. What is spoken in this room will be spoken nowhere else. He paused for a breath. In return, when the Targaryen question requires a public answer, when the claimant requires the support of a great house in open court, I will expect Dorne to be available. When the right claimant stands, Oberyn said, Dorne will not be found absent. The agreement existed between them now. Both men understood it was not a treaty, would never be recorded, and was therefore exactly as binding as each of them chose to make it, which, given the particular nature of both men's reputations for keeping commitments that served their interests, was binding enough to act on. Varys moved back to the window. Oberyn joined him. The courtyard below was empty and dark. Beyond the Red Keep's walls, the city exhaled its nighttime breath, the black water on the air, coal smoke drifting from the harbor district, the particular smell of 500,000 people living against each other in the dark. Varys looked at the city for a long moment. The realm has survived dragons, he said. Madness, war, succession crises that should have split it permanently. His voice had the quality it always had when he was saying one thing and meaning another. Calm on the surface, the real meaning moving underneath like a current beneath still water. It can survive one more secret, if it is the right one. Oberyn looked past the city's roofline. North, past the dark buildings, past the King's Road disappearing into the flat black beyond the walls. Toward the wall, toward what was accumulating behind it. The secret, he said, isn't the problem. He picked up the spear from where it leaned against the wall. He did not look back. The winter is. He left through the narrow corridor, turning his shoulders sideways in the dark. The stone pressing close on both sides. Behind him, the candle continued its work for a while longer. Then, it went out. The throne room was full in the way it only became full when something was about to happen that could not be undone. Lords who had been in King's Landing for a fortnight and found reasons to avoid the court had found reasons to attend it today. Household knights stood 3 deep along the walls. The herald's voice, announcing the formal opening of the session, traveled the length of the room and came back off the far stone as something smaller than it had left. The Iron Throne sat empty. Tommen would be brought in when the procedural business was concluded and a royal presence was required. Until then, the room conducted itself under the authority of the Hand, which was a particular kind of irony that Oberyn noted and set aside. He stood before the dais with the Dornish delegation ranged behind him. To his left, Tyrion Lannister, wearing clean clothes for the first time in a fortnight, carrying a leather satchel with the specific careful grip of a man transporting something fragile and irreplaceable. Two Tyrell lords, Lord Hewitt and Sir Bertram Flowers, arranged through channels that would not be traceable to Olenna before the day was done, stood among the assembled lords with the careful neutrality of men who had been told exactly what neutrality would look like when it was needed. Tywin Lannister sat in his chair to the right of the empty throne, the chair that was not the throne, but was, in every practical sense, where the realm's decisions had been made for the past year. He wore the badge of the hand. He sat with the stillness of a man who had occupied positions of absolute authority for so long that stillness had become indistinguishable from the furniture. Oberyn began. "Your Grace." He addressed the empty throne by habit, the way all formal petitions were addressed, then turned to take in the assembled court. "I come before this session on behalf of the Principality of Dorne, invoking the terms of formal petition preserved in the Treaty of Union between Dorne and the Iron Throne. I ask this court to open a formal inquiry into the conduct of Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, during the sack of King's Landing, in the matter of the deaths of Princess Elia Martell, the Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, and the infant Prince Aegon Targaryen." He paused. The room was very quiet. He continued. "In support of this petition, I present the sworn testimony of Sir Willem Knott, a man-at-arms who served in the Lannister vanguard during the sack and was present in the Tower of the Hand when Lord Tywin issued orders to his commanders." He produced the document. Sir Willem's testimony, sworn before a septon and witnessed by 3 members of the Dornish delegation, states that he heard Tywin Lannister give specific verbal instruction regarding the treatment of the royal family. The instruction was not take them prisoner. The instruction was not secure them. The instruction, in the words of Sir Willem's sworn account, was, "See it done." The room absorbed this. Tywin stood. He did not move toward the dais. He stood at his chair with the composed authority of a man who has been managing rooms far more dangerous than this one since before most of the lords present were born. When he spoke, his voice carried without effort, because 67 years of being obeyed had given it a quality that required no volume to project. The petition as presented relies upon the testimony of a single unnamed soldier whose account concerns events 17 years past, during the chaos of an active military sack, in a city that was simultaneously burning from the Mad King's own actions. He looked at Oberyn with the flat attention of a man identifying a problem, rather than feeling threatened by it. The law does not hold commanders responsible for the independent actions of soldiers operating in active engagement. Gregor Clegane acted as soldiers act in such circumstances. Prince Oberyn is not a neutral arbiter of Dornish grievances. He is the grievance itself, standing in this room and presenting his own cause as though it were evidence. A pause. This court should recognize the petition for what it is. It was a strong argument. It was accurate on several of its legal points. It was the argument that would have closed the room 3 weeks ago, before the Dragon Pit, before Doran's letter to Tommen, before second Tyrell lords had received private conversations they would not discuss publicly. Oberyn waited for the Tyrell lords to respond to Tywin's argument. They said nothing. The silence from the Reach section of the gallery lasted perhaps 4 seconds. In practical terms it lasted much longer, long enough for every lord in the room to register it, to note that Lord Hewitt had not spoken, to note that Sir Bertram was studying the floor with interest, to understand that the architecture of the room had changed while they were sitting in it. Tywin registered it too. Something in his face did not move, but the quality of his stillness shifted by a degree that Oberyn had been watching for and found. "If the court will permit," Tyrion said. He opened the satchel. The letters were copies, precise copies. Each detail verified against the originals that Varys's birds had confirmed, and that Olenna's maid had located before Varys had needed to. The originals were in a location Oberyn would not identify in open court, available for verification by any maester the crown chose to appoint. Tyrion set the copies before the herald with the brisk efficiency of a man who had spent years on the small council and understood what the presentation of evidence in a formal proceeding required. "These letters," Tyrion said, "bear the seal of the hand of the king. They are dated in the weeks prior to the events at the Twins, where Robb Stark, his mother, his household, and 3,500 of his bannermen died under the protection of guest right. He did not raise his voice. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has prepared his statement, and the statement is sufficient, and performance would only diminish it. The first letter reads, in the relevant part, the Warden of the North's bannermen will be accounted for. Frey knows what is required. Ensure Bolton understands the same. He looked up. The seal is the hand's seal. The hand that wrote it is my father's hand. I have read that hand on documents since I was old enough to hold a page. The room went cold in the specific way rooms go cold when a truth that everyone has privately suspected for some time is placed in front of them in documentary form and can no longer be managed as rumor. In the back of the gallery, where the household knights of 3 northern lords who had been attending court on unrelated business stood behind their masters, one man's hand had found his sword hilt. Then, a second man's hand. Neither drew. Both held. A Stormlands lord in the third row of the gallery had turned to say something to the man beside him and had stopped with his mouth open. The sentence unfinished, looking at the letters in the herald's hands. The Reach lords said nothing. They continued saying nothing with the coordinated precision of people who had been told exactly how long to say nothing and for what purpose. Tywin did not sit down. He remained standing. Copies are not evidence, he said. The originals have not been presented before this court. The chain of custody for these documents has not been established. The legal standard for accusing a serving hand of the king of conspiracy requires. The originals are available, Oberyn said, for examination by any maester appointed by the crown. Their location will be provided to that maester upon his appointment. The chain of custody will be established in full at the formal inquiry. He looked at Tywin. The petition does not ask for conviction today. It asks for an inquiry, a formal process in which the originals will be verified, the chain of custody established, and the evidence weighed by impartial examination. His voice did not change. I am asking for a process, Lord Tywin, not a verdict. A process is the thing you are working very hard to prevent. Tommen was brought in. He entered from the side door in the way child kings entered when they had been dressed and briefed, and told what was happening by people they trusted. He was wearing the crown with the careful attention of someone who had not yet stopped noticing its weight. He walked to the throne and sat on it with the particular self-consciousness of a boy who understood that the sitting was formal and important without entirely understanding why. Margaery was beside him. She had been there when Oberyn's brief summary of the session reached Tommen's chambers that morning. She had been there while Tommen processed it. Asked questions she answered with the careful precision of a woman who understood that the answers she gave today would shape the answers this king gave for the rest of his reign. She leaned close now and said something in a voice too quiet to carry beyond the throne. Tommen looked at his grandfather, then at Oberyn, then at the letters in the herald's hands. The crown. He stopped. Started again with the deliberate care of a child choosing each word before it left his mouth. The crown will hear the full evidence in formal inquiry. The evidence presented today will be examined by a panel of maesters appointed by the Citadel, not by any party to the proceeding. He paused. Margaery did not lean in again. He had what he needed. Pending that inquiry, Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, is to stand down from the handship of the king until the matter is resolved. The silence that followed had a different quality from the silences earlier in the session. This one had weight to it, the weight of something irreversible having just been said by the only person in the room with the formal authority to say it. Oberyn looked at Tywin's face for the long paragraph the moment required. He was not afraid. That had never been a possibility, and was not one now. He was not broken, not diminished, not the man who had walked away from a field in Chapter 2's final image. He was standing in the throne room of the kingdom he had governed through 3 reigns. Having just been publicly stripped of his office by a child, guided by a girl, guided by his enemies, and his face was doing the thing that Tywin Lannister's face did, instead of showing fear, it was calculating. Not the next move. 3 moves, beyond the next move. He was reading the room the way he had read rooms since Robert Baratheon was a young man bleeding on a battlefield, counting allies. Measuring distances, identifying the precise mechanisms by which the current situation could be dismantled and rebuilt in a configuration that served him. He was not done. The certainty of this was in every line of his face. A man who had been behind before, and understood that being behind was a position, not a verdict. He looked at Oberyn. The look lasted 2 seconds and communicated several things that neither man would have been willing to say aloud in this room. Among them the mutual acknowledgement that what had begun in the dragon pit was not finished, and would not be finished for some time. Then he looked at Jaime. Jaime was standing against the wall in his white armor, as he had stood throughout the session, watching the proceedings with an expression Oberyn could not read from this distance. Tywin looked at his son with the specific searching quality of a man reading a face he has read thousands of times, looking for a variable he does not yet have a value for. Jaime did not move. He looked back. Tywin reached up. He unclipped the badge of the hand from his chest. He walked to the table before the throne, the badge small and gold in his fingers, and he placed it on the table's surface with the deliberate care of a man setting something down rather than surrendering it. The sound it made against the wood was very small for what it represented. "As my king commands," he said. He walked toward the exit. Every lord in his path moved to let him pass. Not from fear, exactly, from the specific wariness of people who understood that a lion walking away from a field was more dangerous than one still standing in it. The throne room breathed. Oberyn looked at the badge on the table. He looked at Tommen, who was watching his grandfather's back with an expression that contained, somewhere beneath the composure Margaery had given him, the face of a boy who had just done something he could not undo, and was only beginning to understand what that meant. The petition had been granted. The inquiry would open. The letters would be verified. The first wall had come down. The lion was not dead. Oberyn had no interest in dead lions. He had interest in lions who had been removed from positions where they could crush people quietly, and were now visible, in the open, where everything they did could be seen. Visible things could be answered. Shae had already testified against Tyrion before the dragon pit. That testimony, given in the original trial proceedings, was rendered legally moot the moment the gods spoke through their champion's victory. The charge it supported no longer existed. But Tywin was not finished with Shae. He would not be finished with her. The new inquiry Oberyn had opened would require new witnesses, new instruments of humiliation, new ways to turn Tyrion's private life against him in public proceedings. A man who had used Shae once as a weapon would reach for her again, and the second use would not be the last. Tyrion visited her privately. He told her the truth about what was coming, the inquiry, the way she would be approached, the specific shape of her role in Tywin's strategy if she remained within the city's reach. He did not ask her to stay or go. He gave her accurate information about her situation and enough gold to act on it. She asked 2 questions. She received 2 answers. She chose to go. The Lysene trader left the harbor 3 hours before dawn, its manifest listing a Lysene woman and 2 trunks of household goods as passenger freight. The 3 Dornish men who escorted her to the harbor did not speak to her. She did not speak to them. She boarded without looking back. Tywin's instrument in the new proceedings was now on the summer sea. The second use would not happen. The note reached the City Watch captain on the 3rd morning after Tommen's interim order. It was anonymous, written on plain vellum in a plain hand, and contained an address beneath the sept of Baelor's lesser outbuilding and 1 instruction. Dig. They dug. The first jar was found 4 feet down, sealed in oilcloth, its contents the pale, viscous green that the most senior gold cloak present recognized from his years of duty during Robert's reign. He called for a second lantern and did not bring it close. He sent for the captain without touching the jar. By evening, they had found 11. By the following morning, when the captain's report reached the small council, the number was 23. The report did not name the Queen Regent. It did not need to. A wildfire cache of this size, positioned beneath the largest sept in the capital, had been placed by someone with the means and authority to do so without the City Watch's knowledge. The number of people meeting those criteria was small, and the City Watch captain was not a stupid man, and neither were the 14 lords who had read the report before noon. Cersei was not arrested. Oberyn had not intended her arrest. Not yet. Not this way. What he intended was the image that now existed in the minds of every lord who had read the report, the queen regent of the city that was sitting on enough wildfire to burn itself to the waterline. A city now looking at its own streets, and wondering what else lived underneath them. The practice yard was empty at the hour before the second bell. Torches along the wall threw long shadows across the sand. Jaime was working through a sequence of defensive forms alone, which was what he did when he had too much to think about and no opponent willing to provide distraction. Oberyn watched him from the entrance for a moment. He still moved well, compensating for the missing right hand with his footwork, in ways that had stopped looking like compensation and started looking like technique. A man who had adapted to loss without letting it make him cautious. That was worth understanding. He stepped into the yard. Jaime stopped. He did not reach for a weapon. He looked at Oberyn with the flat, prepared wariness of a man who has been waiting for a private conversation he knew was coming and has not yet decided what he will say during it. "You want something," Jaime said. "I want you to testify," Oberyn said. Jaime was quiet for a moment. About what? Specifically, there are several things currently under legal consideration. Not about Cersei. Not about your children. Not about the Kingslayer matter, which is a separate question for a separate day. Oberyn moved to stand 6 feet from him, close enough for a quiet conversation, far enough to be clearly non-threatening to a man holding a practice sword. About the sack. About what you heard before you took your position with the king that day. About what you were told would happen. About what you understood was being done while you were standing in the throne room. Jaime looked at him without speaking. "You have carried the Kingslayer name for 17 years, Oberyn said. He did not change his tone. Not an appeal, a delivery of facts. You killed Aerys to save a city he was about to burn. Every man who knows that calls you Oathbreaker regardless. Because every man who knows that was not in the throne room and has not been given a version of events he found worth trusting." He held Jaime's gaze. "I am not asking you to perform heroism. I am not asking you to confess to crimes you did not commit, or to implicate yourself in things that are not yours. I am asking you to say, under oath, before the court, what you heard and what you understood. The exact truth. Not more. Not less." Jaime set the practice sword down against the yard wall. He stood with his back to Oberyn for a moment. When he turned around, his face had the quality of a decision being examined rather than made. The decision had been made some time ago, perhaps in the gallery during the proceeding, when he had watched 200 lords register the weight of something he had been carrying alone for 17 years. Before the sack began, Jaime said, "My father called me to the yard outside the Tower of the Hand. This was before I took my position at the throne room door. He told me the city would be taken before nightfall. He told me to stand with Aerys and keep him occupied. He told me that his men would handle what needed handling, and that I was to look the other way." He paused. I understood what that meant. I understood that the royal family was included in what needed handling. I went to the throne room. I stood at Aerys's door. He looked at Oberyn. And then I killed Aerys before he could burn the city, and everything else happened without me, and I have not spoken of any of this since. He met Oberyn's eyes. "That is the truth," he said. "I don't know if it's the truth you need. It is the truth the room needs to hear from a man the room cannot dismiss," Oberyn said. "Not from a Dornish prince pursuing a grievance. Not from a dwarf whose life depends on the verdict. From a Kingsguard. From a man who was present, who served his office in every other particular with whatever honor he was permitted, and who is choosing, once, publicly, to let one true thing be spoken under oath." He paused. "You have wanted to do one honest thing in that court since the day Aerys died, and no one believed your account of it. This is the opportunity." The silence lasted long enough to mean something. "Tomorrow," Jaime said. "Send word when the session opens." He said it the next day with the brevity of a man who had decided on the exact number of words required and would not spend one more. "Before the sack began, my father instructed me to take my position with the king and to look the other way regarding whatever his men did in the city that day. I understood this to include the royal family. I was told they would be handled." He looked at the assembled lords without flinching. "I went to the throne room. I stood at my post. I killed Aerys before he could burn the city with wildfire. A single beat. I looked the other way on everything else. I did." The room understood every word. He was alone in the solar when the day's last light left it. The documents on his desk were still organized. He had not stopped working because Tywin Lannister did not stop working, because stopping was what a man did when he had accepted a situation rather than planning to alter it. He had been stripping the hand's official correspondence from his files since the previous afternoon, cataloging what needed to be moved, secured, transferred to Kevan, or burned in ways that left nothing reconstructible. He was not panicking. He was conducting an inventory. The Tyrells had moved faster than his model predicted, and the precision of that error bothered him more than its consequence. He had assessed Olenna Tyrell as a woman who would hold her position until holding it became untenable. He had been wrong in the specific way that was most instructive. She had moved before untenable. At the moment, an alternative presented itself that was better than her current position regardless of timing. He had misread her tolerance for risk. He would not misread it again. Oberyn Martell he had misread from the beginning, and he could now identify the shape of the misreading with the precision of a man who catalogued his failures as carefully as his victories. He had assumed a man carrying a 20-year vendetta would complete it before pivoting to anything larger. It had not occurred to him that the man would look at the completion of his vendetta and identify it as a distraction from a larger objective. That was not how men who had carried grief for 20 years behaved. He had underestimated the capacity for self-correction in a man motivated by something older than anger. He would not underestimate it again. The Tyrells would not sustain their Dornish alignment past 2 years. Mace was too vain and too stupid for a partnership of equals to survive, and Olenna was too old to manage him indefinitely. The inquiry had a legal process. Legal processes had mechanisms that could be slowed. Kevan was honorable, and honorable men were predictable, and predictable men were manageable. There were Westerland's lords who had not yet declared. There were levers that had not yet been pulled. He was behind. He had been behind before. He turned back to the documents on his desk and continued working. Oberyn declined the handship in the same breath as Tommen offered it, in the small council chamber, before the offer could be formally recorded. Dorne cannot hold the handship while a Dornish petition is before the court, he said. The inquiry I brought is a Dornish grievance. The realm needs a hand whose appointment reads as stabilization, not as the next stage of the same conflict. He let the room absorb this. I nominate Sir Kevan Lannister. The silence that followed had the quality of an unexpected solution being recognized as correct. Kevan was 60 years old, gray, deliberate, and had spent his life performing the specific function of making the systems his brother built actually function. He had no documented connection to the Red Wedding. He had no documented connection to the sack beyond proximity to a family whose name was on the documents. He was a Lannister in blood and a functionary in practice. And the realm's bannermen could accept a Lannister hand who was not Tywin without feeling their interests had been transferred to an enemy house. Kevan looked at Oberyn for a long moment. You are asking me to serve the realm, he said. I am asking the realm not to collapse while the work is finished, Oberyn said. Those are not different things. Kevan accepted. The appointment was formalized before the evening bell. His first order concerned the immediate audit of all wildfire stores in King's Landing, phrased in the careful language of public safety, signed by a hand whose name was not Cersei's and not Tywin's, and therefore difficult to refuse without explaining why the refusal was necessary. Oberyn walked out of the small council chamber into the long corridor and stood for a moment in the quiet of it. He thought about the Dornish host. 10 days from the city. Still coming, steady as the tide. He thought about the wall. He had perhaps 3 years. Less, if the cold arrived early. He moved toward the stairs. The small council chamber smelled of old candle wax and the dust of documents that had been moved and replaced so many times they had ground themselves into the stone of their shelves. Kevan Lannister sat in the hand's chair with the careful correctness of a man occupying it on loan, not provisional in his authority, but precise about its scope. He had served in this room for years as his brother's second voice and had not spent that time imagining himself in the senior chair. The adjustment was visible only in the way he sat slightly forward, as though the furniture had not yet decided whether to accept him. Tyrion occupied a chair to his left bearing no formal designation, placed there that morning at Oberyn's suggestion. Varys sat in his customary position with hands folded and an expression offering nothing useful to anyone trying to read it. Two Reach lords attending as observers sat along the wall with the particular alertness of men who have been told they are there to listen and are doing it very carefully. Oberyn sat across from Kevin. Not the hand's position, not a supplicant's. The position of a man who had arranged this meeting and was attending it as a courtesy to the institution. The Baelish matter, Kevin said. He named it the way a man names something he has decided cannot be left off the table, despite being uncertain he wants it on it. The evidence Varys has prepared, I want this council's position to be clear. We do not act on information whose origin cannot be disclosed in open proceeding. The origin can be disclosed, Varys said. His voice carried the pleasant precision it always carried when he was about to be thorough and devastating. The financial documents were obtained from the Master of Coin's official records, which are Crown property subject to small council audit at any time. The instruments are public record in the Iron Bank's ledgers, accessible to any authorized Crown agent. The testimony regarding Lord Baelish's instruction to Lady Lysa Arryn comes from two independent witnesses with no connection to Dorne or to the Tywin inquiry. He placed a stack of documents on the table with the unhurried care of a man who has organized them in the precise order they will be needed. The chain of custody is clean. Lord Baelish was meticulous in his own way, but he believed these records would remain under his control. They did not. Kevin looked at the documents with the grim recognition of a man who had spent 40 years watching his brother manage rooms through selective disclosure and understood the architecture of what was on the table from the inside. Specifically, Tyrion said, from his unofficial chair, in the tone of a man who had been waiting some years to say the words he was now saying. Petyr Baelish embezzled from the Crown Treasury through a system of deferred debt instruments designed to make the books appear balanced, while systematically transferring Crown revenue to private accounts in Braavos and Myr. The total, across the period of his mastership of coin, is not a figure that rounds cleanly. He set the relevant document down. Beyond the financial crimes, Lord Baelish provided false testimony to Lady Catelyn Stark, identifying a Lannister dagger as the weapon in the attempt on Bran Stark's life. That testimony was the first link in the chain that brought Stark bannermen south and opened the war. A pause that was not for effect, but for accuracy. He also instructed Lady Lysa Arryn to poison her husband Jon Arryn and to write to her sister naming the Lannisters as responsible. We can document the instruction. We have the letter in Lysa's hand confirming it. The two Reach lords along the wall had stopped listening carefully and started listening in the manner of men hearing something that has significant implications for decisions they made, based on information they now understood to have been false. Kevin was quiet for a long moment. A warrant, he said, issued in the Crown's name, demanding Lord Baelish's return to King's Landing to answer formal charges before this council. Lord Jon Royce and the senior lords of the Vale are to be informed of the warrant and its grounds. He looked at Varys, through official channels. Naturally, Varys said, then we issue it. The document was drafted, sealed, and in a raven's leg before the session concluded. Somewhere in the Eyrie, a man who had built his entire life on the premise that no one would ever have the patience to trace the full architecture of what he had done, was going to learn that someone had found the patience. The Dornish host arrived at the city's east gate 2 hours past noon. The Goldcloak captain at the gate had been told to expect them. The telling had not adequately prepared him for 300 Dornish cavalry arriving in column, after 14 days of forced march and sea transit, their horses still salt-dried from the harbor. They rode Dornish sandsteeds, narrow-chested, bred for endurance rather than mass, and their riders sat them with the ease of people for whom a horse was not a vehicle, but a judgment about how fast the world required covering. Captain Daemon Uller rode at the column's head. Dark, lean, wearing Martell orange, a helmet he had not removed since the Planky Town. He stopped at the gate and looked at the Goldcloak captain without expression. Prince Doran Martell sends his greetings to King Tommen, he said, and his knights. The Goldcloak captain looked at the 300 men behind him. He looked at their weapons, their horses, the specific quality of readiness in the way they occupied their saddles, the readiness of people who had traveled overland and across open water in 14 days, and had arrived without being diminished by it. He made the calculation that a man of reasonable intelligence makes when confronted with something legally present and physically significant. He opened the gate. The column moved through, The sound of 600 hooves on King's Landing stone was a particular sound, not war, not ceremony, but the sound of something that had come a very long way for a specific purpose and arrived exactly where it intended. People in the street stepped back. Some watched from doorways. A child on a rooftop counted until he ran out of numbers and started over. Oberyn watched from a second-floor window as they passed below. He counted to 300. All of them. He had not been certain, in the weeks since sending the cipher, whether he would reach 300. He reached it. He felt something he did not often feel, and was not going to name. The specific relief of a piece arriving on the board that you set in motion when you were not sure you would survive long enough to see it land. The appointment was read into the small council's formal record that afternoon. Tyrion Lannister is hereby named Special Advisor to the Crown on Northern Affairs, specifically charged with assessment, documentation, and reporting to the small council on the security situation at and beyond the wall, with particular attention to threats of existential character. Tyrion had read the language 3 times before agreeing to it, which was exactly twice more than necessary, and precisely what Oberyn had expected. Existential character, Tyrion had said. It needs to be in the record, Oberyn had said. Everything we do in the next 3 years needs to be findable in the formal record. When the threat arrives and the court attempts to claim it was unforeseen, there must be documentation proving it was foreseen and acted upon. You are the documentation. Tyrion had looked at him for a moment. Then he had signed it. The position had no precedent. It had a small budget, a mandate, and the specific bureaucratic legitimacy of having been approved by the small council, recorded by the maester, and signed by the king. It was the first official acknowledgement in the history of the Iron Throne that what lived beyond the wall was a matter of crown policy. It would not be the last. He walked alone in the city that evening. No spear, no escort, plain dark wool that did not mark him as anything a street could identify. King's Landing in the early evening had the quality it always had. Too many people and not enough space, the smell of cook fires and animals and the river running somewhere underneath everything like an unacknowledged truth. He bought flatbread from a stall near the Street of Steel and ate it standing at the corner. The woman who sold it had flour on her wrists and the specific tiredness of someone who had been standing for 12 hours with 4 more remaining. She did not recognize him. He was a man in dark wool at a corner. He was nobody. He had spent his life being somebody in every room, and the anonymity felt, for a few minutes, like rest. The city's mood was not joy, not relief in any simple sense. It was something more specific and more durable, the absence of the particular dread that settles into a city when the people running it are making decisions that will eventually fall on everyone below them. The bread price had not changed. The gold cloaks were conducting themselves with marginally more restraint than the previous administration. Because Kevin's first domestic order had been a conduct standard reminder that Tywin had never found worth issuing. Small things. Small folk noticed small things because large things were by definition out of their reach. He finished the bread. He walked to the walls. The city spread below him in the last of the light, the black water to the south, moving dark and slow toward the sea. The King's Road running north through the Crown Lands until it disappeared into the dark beyond the city's reach. The harbor to the east, where Dornish sandsteeds were being watered in their temporary stalls, 300 horses drinking deeply after a crossing that had been difficult and was already finished. He looked south, toward Dorne, toward the water gardens where his brother had exhaled over a cipher and set an army moving, toward his daughters, alive and unaware that the shape of their futures had been altered in a fighting pit while their father was dying and then was not dying. He looked north. Past the road. Past the King's Road. Past the last castle before the wall and the wall itself, and everything that lived beyond it in the cold that was not ordinary cold. 500,000 people breathed in the city below him. They were alive. The specific circumstances of how they had come to remain alive on this particular evening were not known to them, and would not be, and did not need to be. They were alive. The city was standing. The letters were in the formal record. The inquiry was open. The warrant was sent. The Dornish advance party was stabled and fed. The Hand was a man who would not burn anyone. He had done a great deal in 3 weeks. He thought about what 3 years required. Ravens to the Night's Watch with specific information about dragonglass deposits on Dragonstone. Arrangements for northern lords who would need to be told what was coming in language they would find credible. The Stark question. Sansa in the Vale now subject to a warrant that would disrupt Littlefinger's hold. Bran somewhere beyond the wall that Varys's birds could not yet reach. Arya in a location that Varys was still working to confirm. The North would need to be ready. The North would only be ready if someone it trusted was carrying the message north. He thought about the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Young, Varys had said. Controversial election still ahead. Someone the Watch would follow somewhere they had never been asked to follow anyone before. He did not know the name yet. He would find out. The city kept its noise below him, alive in the way cities are alive, continuous, unaware, burning its own small fires against the dark. He stayed on the walls a long time, looking north. There was a letter he had not written. He had thought about it every morning for 3 weeks, since the Dragon Pit, since the choice. He had considered what to say, how to say it, what it meant to write to someone who could not receive letters. Elia, dead 17 years in a room he was never permitted to see, in a city she should never have been brought to, by a family that had decided her life was worth less than their political positioning. He could not write the letter. He would never write the letter. What he could do, and had done, was say her name in a court that spent 17 years pretending she required no naming. What he could do was put the man who ordered her death in a room with lawyers and witnesses and the specific intractable process of formal accountability. What he could do was ensure that the court's permanent record contained the names Rhaenys and Aegon, not as footnotes in someone else's history, but as people who had existed, who had been 3 years old and infant and present in the world, who had been murdered by men following a specific instruction from a specific man, who was now confined to his chambers pending an inquiry he could not simply will away. It was not enough. He had always known it would not be enough. The question had never been whether it would be enough. The question was whether it was what was possible. It was what was possible. He set the unwritten letter aside and went to work. 3 weeks had built a different court inside the same stone. Tywin Lannister remained in the capital, confined to the Tower of the Hand by formal restriction while the inquiry assembled its evidence. He was not in chains. He had not been arrested. He was a man of 67 years sitting in a room with documents and advocates, exercising the particular sour patience of someone who has been blocked, but not stopped. Oberyn received a report on his activities each morning. Every morning it confirmed the same thing: Tywin was still planning. Still writing letters that Varys's birds noted without opening. Still pulling threads that had not yet gone taut. That was acceptable. Threads that had not gone taut could be watched. The Tyrells had held. Mace had bluffed twice about withdrawing from the new alignment and been redirected both times by Olenna, in the specific way Mace had been redirected his entire adult life. Through managed information, quiet flattery, and the careful installation of consequences he would find unpleasant. Willis's public letter, read in open court, had removed the last structural support from Mace's position. He was performing discontent. He would not act on it. Varys moved in the city's shadows inside the terms, agreed on a narrow corridor, nothing to Tywin. Certain doors opened. Others closed. 3 ravens had gone to Castle Black in Tyrion's name, careful ravens, establishing correspondence without yet making the claims that required a correspondent willing to believe them. The warrant for Littlefinger had reached Jon Royce. The net was tightening in the specific way nets tightened around men who had spent their careers ensuring other people were caught in them. Slowly at first, then faster than expected. The realm was not fixed. Oberyn had never expected to fix the realm. What he had expected was to alter its trajectory by enough degrees that the fixed point it had been heading toward became a different fixed point. A point that did not include a city burning from above or a wall falling into a frozen sea. He believed he had done that. He would not be certain for years. Tyrion found him on the city wall that night, which meant Tyrion had arranged to be on the city wall that night, which meant he had something to say that required the specific privacy of an elevated stone platform overlooking a dark river. Oberyn had brought 2 cups of Dornish red. He handed one over without comment. They stood at the parapet. The Blackwater rush moved below them, slow and dark, carrying the city's residue southward toward the sea. The crown lands beyond the walls were quiet, with the particular quiet of countryside not being actively marched across, a quiet that had become rare enough in recent years to feel like something worth noting. Tyrion drank. He looked at the river for a while. Was it worth it? He asked. Giving up the kill. Oberyn was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, considering the precision of the answer the question required. I did not give up the kill, he said. I chose the larger target. Tyrion turned to look at him. Gregor was the instrument, Oberyn said. He was the hand, and the hand was worth killing, and I killed it. But I came to King's Landing to make the man who gave the order answer for it. That man is answering. He will continue answering until the inquiry concludes, and the inquiry will conclude in the correct direction, because we have the letters and the testimony and a hand who will not suppress the evidence. He looked at the river. I gave up a confession. I gave up the specific theater of making a dying man say the words I had rehearsed for 20 years. I traded that for a formal trial, documentary evidence, and a legal verdict that will outlast both Tywin and me. He picked up his wine. I chose the larger target. Tyrion was quiet for a moment. Then, what comes next? Oberyn told him. He told him about the wall and the vision, not as symbol, not as a failing institution of men who had underfunded it for generations, but as a physical object beginning to lose an argument, with a force that had been patient longer than the wall had been standing. He described the sound beyond it. He told him about the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, young, the election still ahead. Someone the Watch would follow somewhere they had never been asked to follow anyone before. He is the most important person in Westeros, Oberyn said. He does not know that yet. He may never know it in the way that would satisfy a court, but what he does in the next 2 years determines whether there is a Westeros left for any of this to mean anything. I need him to have resources. I need him to have support from the South he is not currently receiving. I need him to know that what he is facing is real, and that there are people below the wall who understand that. Tyrion looked at the dark countryside beyond the walls. You need the North. I need the North ready. The North follows its own name. The Stark name is the only name that unites it. And the Stark name is currently radioactive in King's Landing, which means every surviving Stark is somewhere dangerous, unsupported, and unaware of how badly they are needed. Sansa is in the Vale, Tyrion said. He said it in the tone of a man thinking aloud rather than reporting, the particular thinking aloud of someone finding the shape of a move as they speak it. With Littlefinger, until the warrant reaches Royce and Littlefinger loses his hold over her. He paused. She is Ned Stark's eldest daughter. She is the Lady of Winterfell by every surviving law of inheritance. If she goes north with protection and with her name formally restored, the northern lords rally to her, Oberyn said. And she carries north what she has been told about what is coming. And she believes you? I think she will believe Tyrion Lannister before she believes a Dornish prince she has never met. Tyrion looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in his mismatched eyes, the expression of a man recognizing that he has been positioned for a role designed without his knowledge and finding, against his expectation, that he does not object to it. Bran is beyond the wall, Tyrion said. Arya is somewhere Varys has not confirmed. They will surface, Oberyn said. People with that name and that particular history do not stay lost indefinitely. What matters is that when they do, there is a structure ready to receive them. A realm that has not burned itself beyond recognition. A court with its records in order, and a hand in functional condition. He looked north, a wall still standing. Tyrion was quiet for a long moment, watching the dark countryside, working through something. I know where to start, he said. Oberyn nodded once. They stood on the wall a while longer without speaking, which was the correct way to end a conversation that had covered enough ground. He was alone on the wall when the dawn came. The city below was the same city he had seen burning in the vision, the same rooflines against the same eastern sky, the same arrangement of streets running down to the same harbor where ships were beginning to move in the early light. He had stood in the dragon pit and watched it burn from above, and smelled wildfire that the air did not yet carry, and here it was, the same city. Still standing in the gray beginning of a morning it had not been guaranteed. He thought about his daughters. Obara and Nymeria and Tyene and the rest, alive in Dorne, in the water gardens, in the fierce and unapologetic way Alleria had raised them to live. They did not know what had nearly happened to them on a ship they had not yet boarded. They were alive. They would remain alive. That was the primary fact. Everything else was secondary to it. He thought about Elia. He thought about Rhaenys, who had been 3 years old. He thought about Aegon, who had been an infant. Their names were in the court's permanent record now. The court that had tried to bury them under 17 years of silence had been forced to say them aloud, under oath, before witnesses. The man who had ordered their deaths would stand in a room and answer for them, before a process that could not be bribed, or threatened, or managed into producing the wrong outcome. It was not enough. It was what was possible. He looked north. Past the King's Road, past the last castle before the cold deepened into something different from ordinary cold. Past the wall and the thing beyond it that was not yet moving, but was building toward movement with the patience of something that had been accumulating longer than any human institution had been standing. He did not feel victorious. He had come to King's Landing to say a name and watch a man answer for it, and had instead dismantled a hand, rebuilt a court, issued a warrant, secured an alliance, placed a dwarf in a bureaucratic position that would matter more than any throne in 3 years' time, and lit a signal fire at the edge of the longest night the world had ever faced. He felt prepared. For the first time in 20 years, standing on the walls of a city that was still breathing, in a realm that was less broken than it had been. Looking north toward the thing that was coming, and knowing he had bought the world enough time to face it, prepared was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.